Mr. President, I come to the floor to discuss the Republican tax reform plan and what impact it will have on the fiscal health of our nation, but especially the impact it will have on working families across the United States and in my home state of Illinois. I've represented Illinois in Congress both as a House member and a senator for a number of years, and I'm proud to say that during my career I have not shied away from tackling big issues. Maybe one of the toughest assignments I've ever had was in 2010. President Obama created the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform. It was known as the Simpson-Bowles Commission. I was one of 18 Republicans and Democrats given the responsibility of trying to find a way to balance America's budget and reform our country's largest spending programs and our tax code. This is no small task, but it was an important one. And we spent month after month in bipartisan meetings working at it. Nearly a year after the commission was created, we were asked to vote on the final report. Simpson-Bowles was not a perfect plan, but I decided to vote in favor of the report, and I knew it would be controversial. But I believed then, as I do now, that there is only one honest way to reduce debt. Cut spending, raise revenues, do not ignore the tax code. Bowles-Simpson did just that. It raised revenue by eliminating a lot of the exclusions and deductions and efforts in the tax code to reward certain companies and special interest. And it cut spending from both defense and non-defense. To say nothing of the months-long bipartisan process, a far cry from the current reconciliation that we've been going through this year on the health care issue, there's simply no comparison between the Simpson-Bowles deficit reduction plan and what the Republicans want to bring to the floor of the United States Senate and House this year in the name of tax reform. Simpson-Bowles was about balancing our budget responsibly. It raised nearly $880 billion in revenue over the first decade. And unlike the Republican tax plan, it boosted the standard deduction and still retained the personal exemptions that families claim on their taxes. It protected middle-income families from backdoor cuts, and I underline this, it ensured that the wealthy in America pay their fair share of taxes. If there's one thing I can never understand, it's why the Republicans, in the name of budget deficits or in the names of tax reform, always end up in the same place, always cutting taxes on the wealthiest people in America. Where in the world is that coming from? I've met a lot of wealthy people in the course of my life. Not one of them, with a straight face, has said to me, "Senator, I desperately need a tax cut." They don't. And yet that is the fallback default position on every Republican plan. Importantly, the Simpson-Bowles plan provided details on the hard choices necessary to reach our goal. There's simply no comparison between that comprehensive bipartisan plan that balanced the budget and the highly fiscally irresponsible Republican tax reform plan before us now that will literally add $2.4 trillion to the national debt. How many times have members on the Republican side of the aisle come to the floor to pose for holy pictures and to preach to us about the deficit? Now that they're in the majority and have a president of their party, what's the first thing they do? Propose adding $2.4 trillion to the national debt. Where are my colleagues across the aisle who've been the first to speak out and admonish the Democrats about their failure to recognize the federal debt? Where is my colleague, the majority leader of the Senate, who was so quick to rail on the, quote, alarming level, close quote, of our national debt during the Obama years? He's silent now. Even the most stalwart of self-proclaimed fiscal hawks on the right are falling in line behind this phony plan, which would allow for $1.5 trillion in unpaid-for tax cuts, clinging on to the economic growth projections no responsible economist would dream of. They used to call this economic theory of cutting taxes on the rich and economic growth the Laffer curve. I've never heard a better named description of an economic theory. It's a Laffer. And this Laffer curve inspired the governor of Kansas to bring that state to near fiscal ruin, trying to apply that great theory and watching his state crumble in the process. History has proven that tax cuts simply do not yield economic growth. The economic growth promises of the Bush tax cuts turned out to be completely false. Those tax cuts for the wealthy ballooned our deficits and our debt and contributed to a scandalous rise in income inequality in the United States of America. Tax cuts don't pay for themselves, and I know my Republican colleagues know that. And when Republicans' rosy estimates of economic growth do in fact fail, and the deficit is skyrocketing, the Republican budget spells out exactly how they plan to pay for the tax cuts on the backs of hardworking Americans. And listen to this. To pay for the tax cuts for the wealthiest people in America, the Republican tax reform plan, now get this, cuts $1 trillion in cuts from Medicaid and $470 billion in cuts from Medicare. Think about it. Health insurance for the elderly in America will take a $470 billion cut under the Republican tax reform plan for what? To give tax cuts to the wealthiest people in our country. Go figure. And then $1 trillion in cuts in Medicaid? Well, what is Medicaid for? Isn't it just health insurance for the poor? Well, in some respects, that's a good general description. It's so much more. The Medicaid program, which the Republicans return to time and time again to cut, is critically important for parts of America. Half of the children born in the state of Illinois are taken care of by Medicaid. Their mothers are taken care of before the baby is delivered and after. Plus, it is the #1 source of health insurance for the disabled across America. They want to cut $1 trillion out of it. I haven't even gotten close to the most expensive part of Medicaid. 2/3 of seniors in America in nursing homes count on Medicaid to pay for their medical bills. The Republicans want to cut $1 trillion out of Medicaid to give tax cuts to the wealthiest people in America. What's going to happen to those folks in nursing homes? What's going to happen to the disabled who count on Medicaid? What's going to happen to those mothers and their babies? That's a legitimate question to ask. Make no mistake, the real answer for who pays for these cuts doesn't involve fake economics. It involves real families across America. Let's look at the plan for what it is. While claiming to fix our broken tax code, this Republican tax reform plan would instead provide nothing short of a windfall to the wealthiest in our country and stick hardworking families in Illinois and across the country with the bill. Under the Republican plan, listen, no less than 80% of the benefits go to the top 1% of wealthiest Americans. 80% of the benefits to the wealthiest people in this country. That's more than 3/4 of all tax breaks going to people who will make more than $730,000 a year. Is that why members of the Senate were elected? To take care of people making more than $730,000 a year? Not in my state. And what about the middle-income Americans that this plan's supposed to help? The Republican plan would raise taxes on nearly 1/3 of Americans who make between $50,000 and $150,000 a year. 1/3 of them will pay higher taxes. That's not tax relief for working families. In fact, the Republican plan would eliminate the state and local tax deduction, a deduction used by 1/3 of all taxpayers to reduce their tax bill. That has been part of our tax code from the beginning. And here's the theory. We believe in the current federal tax code, you shouldn't pay a tax on a tax. Basic. If you're paying $1,000 in property taxes where you live right now, should you be taxed on that $1,000? Under the current tax code, no. You're able to deduct state and local taxes. The Republicans eliminate that deduction. If they have their way, families with homes, families paying sales taxes, will be paying a federal tax on the state and local taxes that they pay. This deduction currently allows families that pay state and local income or sales taxes to deduct those taxes from their federal income tax. In other words, this deduction prevents families from double taxation, once by the federal government and again by the state. And yet the Republicans eliminate this deduction. In Illinois, we rank 5th in the nation for people who are helped by the state and local tax deduction. My taxpayers that I represent will be hit especially hard. Nearly 2 million Illinoisans, roughly a third of the taxpayers in my state, claimed more than $24 billion in state and local tax deductions in 2015. If Republicans have their way, almost 2 million people in Illinois would be double taxed on an average $12,500 of earnings. That is just plain wrong. Republicans would have you believe that state and local tax deduction only helps the wealthy. But most people who take this deduction make less than $200,000 a year. Even families who do not claim the state and local deduction will see their taxes increase under the Republican so-called tax reform plan. The Republican plan eliminates the personal exemption, worth $4,050 a person. A family of 4 making $50,000 a year in my state will pay $887 more under this part of the Republican tax reform plan, getting hit by losing the state and local tax deduction and then turn around and losing a personal exemption. A family of 4 in Illinois making $50,000 will pay $887 more a year just on that provision in federal taxes. What are the Republicans raising taxes on my middle class for? They're raising taxes on middle-income families to provide massive tax cuts for corporations to the tune of $2.6 trillion over the first 10 years. And Mr. and Mrs. America, sleep well tonight. We're going to take care of that with economic growth. Here's the reality. Corporate profits are soaring in America. Today, corporate profits in the United States of America as a share of gross domestic product are at record highs. Corporate taxes paid to the federal government as a share of GDP, record low. What is the Republican approach to those two facts? Cut more corporate taxes. Wouldn't it be good to hear someone come to the floor and said, instead of just looking at corporate taxes, why don't we look at corporate employees? How are they doing? We know how they're doing. They're falling behind. They're more productive than ever. The corporations are more profitable than ever, and yet the disparity in income in America gets worse. We've got the best workers in the world. No apologies. They do great work. They don't get paid enough. The answer on the Republican side is give the corporations more tax breaks. I'd say the answer should be something else. Why don't we address the fact that CEOs in America make 271 times the average wage of their employees? 271? Come on. If they're going to head up these corporations, of course they're entitled to be paid more. Their profitability, their entrepreneurial spirit, their talent, and all the rest, but 271 times? American workers are still waiting for their pay raise, and they won't get it with this Republican tax reform plan. While American workers and their families continue to wait for their turn, the Republicans seem determined to provide tax cuts to corporations and the wealthy rather than make the tax code work for working families. This has to stop. It's time we looked at tax reform and economic growth in terms of the family room, not the boardroom. The very successful Warren Buffett has said, and I quote him, "My friends and I have been coddled long enough by a billionaire-friendly Congress. It's time for our government to get serious about shared sacrifice." Thank you, Warren Buffett. I agree. If Republicans want to get serious about fixing the faulty incentives in our tax code and provide working families some relief, it's time they stop clinging to the Laffer curve and this failed trickle-down policy that giving a tax break to the wealthiest person in America can only help the poorest person in America. I know these are difficult and complex issues. It's no secret in Washington how difficult tax reform can be. But these are issues that deserve robust bipartisan debate. Now is not the time to abandon any semblance of fiscal responsibility and rush through this deficit-exploding plan that has no prayer of paying for itself with growth. I hope my Republican colleagues will look beyond the boardroom and seize this opportunity to reward and incentivize businesses to make real investments in the United States and its workers. Look at this tax code. If you own a big business in my state of Illinois and want to move your business out of Illinois to Mexico or China or you name it, we're going to give you a helping hand. Our tax code says that the cost, the moving expenses, deductible. You don't have to pay taxes on those. We're going to give you a break to move your business. What are we thinking? For goodness sakes, why don't we have what Senator Sherrod Brown and I are introducing as an amendment, a Patriot employer's tax break, a Patriot corporation tax break? You keep your business in Illinois. You keep your business in Ohio. When your workforce grows, it's American workers who get the jobs. And the wages that you pay for 90% of them have to be at least $15 an hour. You've got to provide health insurance, a basic retirement plan that is fair, and give a veteran's preference, please, to the men and women who've served our country. And then you know what? We'll give you a tax break. We won't give it to the company ready to move overseas. We'll give it to the company ready to invest in the United States and U.S. workers. Now that, I think, is a tax policy most Americans would say makes sense. Why aren't we talking about that kind of approach instead of finding a way to give a tax break to the wealthiest? Americans, workers, and families are watching this debate, and they're still waiting for a better deal. Mr. President, I yield the floor.